from Authors Buzz, and I am here again with Tabitha. Hi, Tab.
Hi, Amy.
And today we are talking about pacing your novel. So let's get started.
Okay, so pacing, I know we've discussed it a little bit in some other contexts. Essentially, I describe pacing as sort of the flow, the speed, and the rhythm of your novel. And when it's something you don't want to worry about when you're drafting. Let's start off by saying that it's not a thing that you think about when you're trying to get the story out. Just write your story, don't worry about it. It's something you deal with in edits later. But now let's say your draft is finished, you've sent it out there to an editor perhaps or beta readers, and someone comes back and says, the pacing's off in some parts of this book. And you say, what does that mean? Well, to me, it can mean a couple of different things. One thing it can mean is that it's dragging somewhere. And if somebody says, oh, it's dragging here, I wanted to turn the pages, then you know that there's a pacing issue there. Often that means you've been info dumping. You've been giving out too much information all at once that the reader doesn't need yet. So it's not important to them yet. So it's not interesting to them yet. Right. So that's a place where you can
Where
come
they
in.
need it, and the way you do it is just not sprinkle the
Right.
knowledge, and it's like you said, a dump of knowledge.
A dump, or you're just over describing something, and it's just, you could say it in a very concise amount of words, and instead you're using 3 pages to do it. So when you get that note, that's a place to go in and either cut or rearrange, and sprinkle in. So that's one way to do it. The other, you can have the opposite happen. You can be reading something and just suddenly there's one action scene after another action scene after a high intensity scene, and you're never getting an out breath. You're never allowing your reader that moment to sort of decompress and ingest the actions that have just happened, or the characters in the story aren't having that chance either. So there's something off with that kind of thing. So when you get those notes, don't be afraid. You can fix this stuff. Like this stuff is sort of higher level editing things. And I like to look at it from the macro level, which is, the overall picture of the book and the overall pacing. And are there enough highs and lows? And is it sort of in a rhythm that keeps the reader engaged and wanting to sort of dance with your story? And then there are the macro edits, right? Where you kind of can come in and now you've got the basics in place, but now you're finessing each little scene, even down to the sentence. You can work with pacing there. I would say also that depending on what you're writing, there's a different pacing, macro pacing to the story, right? If you're writing like an action adventure thriller, you're going to have more beats like that, right? You're going to have more of those high points and those moments. That's just the nature of the beast. Or a stark horror story might be very sparse with the words, but very intense with the emotion. So, how you're going to pace on a macro level depends on what you're writing. If you're writing literary fiction, you may be spending a lot more time with these beautiful literary descriptions and deeply diving into the character. And but it's pulling the reader into it. It's just pulling them in and pulling them along at a slightly slower pace. That's okay. So that's that macro view. And
So
then the
I would
mic.
say, just as you're speaking, and I don't know that we've said this specifically, but read in your genre so that you get used to, even if you like other genres as well, read in what you write in so that you'll be able to feel what a literary fiction novel feels like, what a thriller feels like, and you'll be able to lay that against what you've done and see whether it fits or not.
Yes, absolutely. And it's not the comparing yourself to other writers. We talked about this in the last one. We don't want to do that. That's crippling. But what it does do is it gives you a sense for what works, right? And if your reader experience is positive in that particular story, you can back out and ask yourself why. Wow, there were just these emotional moments just were right at the right time, just when you needed that, or this resolution piece to that one little plot arc came right at the right time, just when I needed it to. If it had dragged out any longer, I would have been frustrated. If it had happened too quickly, it would have just been, it wouldn't have had as much meaning. So that's part of the style and the skill of working with pacing. So there's a lot of places. So then once you get that sense, and I think I mentioned this before, that I was on a panel with a woman and she was talking about pacing, and she
Oh,
actually color coded sections of her manuscript with little stickers, right? That if there were too many green stickers or whatever color they were, that were those high moments, the really intense ones clumped together, she knew that they needed to maybe be trickled out later, or if it was just yellow, 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 or whatever, the draggy stuff. Okay, now I need to add some action in between. And what a great visual, right? To see from a big picture perspective.
No, as you're speaking, you know what it reminds me of? It sounds a little bit what I've noticed with my characters when I'm writing them, I don't there's not enough contrast. It's kind of like their personality is like all yellow, and then I need to tweak them, tweak their highs and lows a little bit so that they pop out on the page. Because I think when I first write, I write more like how a normal person would be. And even though you want your characters to be relatable, they also need to be a little bit larger than life and certain characteristics. Do you think it corresponds to that at all?
Oh, I think it's definitely sort of another like complementary thing, and I mentioned this in another video that we did, that I got a note back that my characters, I wrote thank you 92 times in my manuscript. That was actually Ron that said that as a beta reader of both of ours, who gives
He would
great
know
notes.
the over politeness for sure.
And I was like, but that was saying something. Everything was too flat. The characters were too similar. Their voices didn't pop, individually, because I was using the same phrasing in every circumstance, right? So it is a similar kind of a thing to look for. And, that's colorful characters and characters that have a voice. It feels when you can get their dialogue. Dialogue is a place where you have an opportunity to play with pacing. You can When you put those characters under stress, what happens to their speech and language? Do they ramble on, because they're nervous, right? Or do they stop and speak in single word sentences because they're nervous? So there's ways that when you're crafting a scene, now we're talking like what I call the micro pacing things. When you're crafting the scene and you've got a high intensity scene, now you can look carefully at how would these characters be speaking if they're in a dogfight, right? And all of a sudden the enemy appears out of nowhere. Are they suddenly waxing poetic about the stars and the sky glimmering over the whatever? No, they're probably like, holy crapadoodle, there's another ship coming. We gotta, or there's fear. Like, what does that sound like on the page? And if you're creating even if there's no dialogue and just creating a scene, what does it mean to feel like a sense of suspense? What kind of language are you trying to use to build that sentiment? And you can then go in scene by scene and sort of like finesse a little bit for each type of scene that you are working on.
I
So,
think that watching shows helps you discern what works and what doesn't. Sometimes something happens in the action and characters chat and it makes sense. And then there are other times you're watching something and somebody talks about something that's way from left field and it slows everything down and it almost feels like a space filler and definitely an info dump.
yeah, right. And when you start to recognize that in other things, whether it's books or, TV shows or movies, you can start to correct it in your own work. And it's always helpful to have other people read it to identify those areas, because what you intend and what somebody else perceives aren't always the same thing. And so you want to know that go out of the gate, like if somebody else isn't perceiving, and we've talked about this with relation to characters, but also with a particular scene, if they're not feeling, if you're trying to set a stage for something or describe a scene and it's just something the character doesn't care about or the reader doesn't care about in that moment, it doesn't matter that this piece of information is important and needs to be shared, or this part of the world is important. It means it's in the wrong place, or it's just not being delivered in a way that is exciting enough or at the right time, that the reader's not interested in it at that
And
time.
and how many times have we found when we get a note like that, all it requires is one sentence someplace else.
Yeah,
You have
exactly.
paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, and all you need is a phrase or sentence, and it
Right.
takes care of all of that.
And it takes care of all of it. And you can't be afraid to do that. You can't be afraid to take out this big chunk and turn it into one line that then makes the writing that much more powerful and engaging and, like moves it along or slows it down, whatever it needs in that moment. So you can't be afraid to do that, but that requires you, I think, to step back from your manuscript. We talk a
Right.
lot
And
about.
I just kind of thought of an example. You could have a character have this whole scene where they have a dialogue and they're talking about something that happened to them in school, and this whole Or you could just have them see something and have the quick thought or the quick thing that, just like it was just back in high school again. And we know that, oh, something similar to what we just saw in this scene. And that's all we need. We don't need the whole backstory. We just need to know that there's a connection
Yes.
that is psychologically important to this character.
Yes. And often edits will come back if you have flashback scenes, big flashback scenes. Somebody will say, this take it out, because it just slows everything down. Unless it's something so compelling or offers a piece of information that you just cannot get any other way, and you need to see it the way that that character is seeing it. Maybe they're seeing it again and they're realizing something that they didn't when it happened originally, and now they're replaying it in their mind and they're like, oh my god, that it has to evoke enough of a aha or a importance or a gravity to put in a flashback
It
scene,
has
because
to be
flashbacks
important.
inevitably slow everything down and pull
It
you
has to
out of
be
the story.
important now, not
Yes.
just
Right.
information. If it's just information, don't have the flashback.
Right.
But if it's somehow important now for the character to go through that,
Right.
the seeing of it, and you try to do it in a way that isn't boring. That kind of brings me another point though, and I know I've done this, I know you've done this. I think when you're going back and you're looking at pacing and you're looking at your draft, almost all of us have almost kind of filler chapters.
Yeah.
We still need to make a bridge for in our story, but like whole chunks need to go.
Yep. I remembered this. I had a scene on a train, and it was a quiet scene, and I needed a quiet moment because had been a lot of action, but it really just slowed things down too much. And so I needed to take little bits of that scene where they're sitting and they're talking to one another. And it's a filler. It was killing time. And it was all information that you needed, the reader needed, but it just didn't belong there, and I had to find other places to put it. And then it was like, and they were on the train, and then they were at their destination, because we don't care about what happened in between, you know what I mean? And I had to take that information and put it elsewhere. And yeah, it was a whole chunk of story that was filler.
Any practical tips for fixing pacing when you notice the
Well,
problem?
yeah, I mean, I think that's again, you go through the big picture thing first and sort out, like, okay, I can move this here, or I can cut this. Those big macro things. I think those are I think they're harder to do initially, because it looks like you're ripping your story apart and putting it back together again. And
A
to
little
a degree
scary.
you are, and it can be a little scary, but once they start to go into the right place, and things are cut out and things move along better, and you've corrected the ripple effect, already you have a better, oh, there goes a train in the background. How fun. You can tell these are live recordings, that we have no editing. Well, I'm in Colorado right now,
There
and the
are
train
other
track.
sides that we don't edit
Yeah,
much.
that's true. There are big signs. Well, honk, honk, honk. And I'm in Colorado, and the Rocky Mountains are right outside the window. So it is sort of cool, but in any case, it's a bit distracting. So anyway,
I
the
don't
big
hear
picture
that much
thing.
from the front.
Okay, good, because it's really loud here. Like when the cat walks across the keyboard, then we know it's like unedited version.
We are real people. We
We
are in the
are.
trenches with you.
Yes, totally. So anyway, those big picture ones, I think, do those first. And those are to a degree easier to see and pick out and say, info dumping here, too much action here, not enough here, a little harder to correct, right? Because that's a bigger, easy to see, harder to decide how you're going to fix. But once you do, and it's sort of, you've got the right overall pacing, then going into the micro, you really want to think what's happening in this scene, and what's appropriate language, style of language, length of sentences, character point of view, all kinds of things, switching perspectives. What is going to maximize the effect that you're trying to achieve? And again, if it's honk, if it's an action scene, sometimes the long drawn out descriptions are not really what you want there. You want to pull people in with the strong verbs and the shorter sentences and the high emotion and intensity. But
You want your writing style to match what's happening.
yes,
And
yes, yes, exactly. So again, go see the big picture structural things first, and then you can finesse scene by scene. with those smaller tweaks that actually really ramp up the
Right. And so
writing.
just going back to the willingness to cut, I believe you do this, and I know I have. You can have a file of your cut scenes, and you can
Yes.
keep them to give yourself some reinsurance, because that's part of what happens if you're
Absolutely.
afraid if you need it.
Yes, absolutely. I keep those, and then
That's the case.
I keep them until I finish and I'm satisfied with the new thing. And then sometimes I'll let them go, but sometimes there's some little nugget there that you're going to use somewhere else. It's not like it's wasted writing. No writing is wasted, even if it gets cut. It's you learn something, you put together a pretty sentence, even if you can't use it in this story, there might be something good there for something else. So I always do that. I keep it just 90% of it'll never be looked at again, but I have to do it for my psychological mental health, whatever. The 10% that is there is might be worth it. It can go somewhere else or live another day in another story.
Which brings up another point. You're going to have to do another close read through, because sometimes when you make all these edits, something you've lost some stuff, and then you need to add in sentences here and there so it flows again.
Right. Like if you've cut out this whole thing that you didn't really need at that moment in time, yet there was a piece of it that was important, you got to make sure you do tell your readers at some point where it's relevant. So.
I've
Oh dear.
process. Any other tips for what? All right. So you said don't worry about pacing in the beginning, but should you have a general idea that a little bit of how you want it to flow when you're making your outline?
I think so, because I think that there are, you naturally, I think when you're writing a story, you're drawn towards those high points or those major like reveals and that sort of thing. And in the beginning, you can sort of map out where each one, where you think it fits in with the story and write it that way. And then if it needs finessing later, like say you've come up with an even better, or this big plot is still the major plot, but you've got a couple of more of, in between that you didn't even think of in the beginning, then that might need to be finagled somewhere else. So, but yeah, I definitely have those high points. I have those moments of resolution, moments of high emotional intensity already starting to swirl in my brain, and they're kind of mapped out loosely where they would go in the story. Like, when does this character, when is she going to learn that, when is he going to learn that she was really an assassin, not his savior, like, and when is the most important? I know that scene has to happen. I think it's about right here. I map it in, I write it that way, but then if it needs to be adjusted for more maximum effect later on, that's a second round kind of.
I do the same thing. I don't know if we can see this, but I also do, move along, then there's a conflict, and then we swirl in there a little bit, and then we need to move. Like, so my story
Yes.
kind of ends up doing like a little thing like that,
Yes.
where you get stuck, you want to get stuck in that eddy, but then you want to get out and get to the next thing. But then the whole thing is like, this is like all underneath. And sometimes I do too many of these. So sometimes I have too many sub conflicts, and then I need to narrow it down to
right.
one.
Put a little more attention into the really important ones and give them a little more space, right? Because that's what I was talking about with, you can exhaust people with too much, right? Or confuse them. Yes, that can happen too.
I've read books like that. I'm like, there's so many things going on here. I forget what we're doing.
Yeah, I don't know what just happened. Oh well.
Like,
yeah,
we clearly must be moving toward like the sword.
Like I've lost my way. Yeah.
Getting the ancestors out who have to like save I read a lot of fantasy, so.
Yes, I'm reading fantasy right now too. I'm writing fantasy right now too, which is super fun.
So fun. Yeah. Any other takeaways that we
so I think that was a pretty good. So there are 2 articles up on our Authors Buzz website to do with pacing. Most of it is what I covered today, but there's other, more detailed stuff in there that might be useful. So check it out, authorsbuzz.com.
Hold on, I need to talk to Alexa for a minute. Real life. Alexa, thank you. I'm all set.
Meanwhile, my dog is barking and the wind is blowing. Today's a real day.
She thinks I'm talking to her. Alexa, stop.
That's really funny.
He was just talking about the Beauty and the Beast castle. So something that we were
Something
talking
about
about.
fantasy she picked up on and was like, I know a fantasy.
And I always laugh at the people who are saying she's listening to everything, but
Clearly she is. Okay, well, I'm gonna stop us now, and we'll say goodbye until next time.